It's a great honor to welcome you all to Washington National Cathedral this evening. My name is Mary Ann Buddy, and I am privileged to serve as the Bishop of the Diocese of Washington. This cathedral, Washington National Cathedral, is a house of prayer for all people. And as a place for spiritual reflection in our nation's capital, it is where our country gathers to mourn, celebrate, and consider critical issues of our day. This is a distinctly American cathedral that tells our nation's story in its stained glass and its statuary. If you look around, you see symbols and signs of the history of our nation beautifully represented in this place. Of particular interest for tonight are two statues, beautiful statues of President Lincoln. A statue in the back on the right, and one of Lincoln at prayer in the stairwell here, just down this side of the cathedral, that if you haven't seen, you must see tonight. There is a carving of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that graces the side aisle, and it was, as of course you know, from this pulpit that he gave his last Sunday sermon in March of 1968, just days before he was taken from us. Tonight, on the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's second inauguration, we will talk about how these two men shaped our nation and how the issues they addressed in their last great speeches are still with us today. The Cathedral is delighted to be sponsoring this program with Ford's Theater, and I personally am delighted to welcome Paul Tatro, director of Ford's Theater. Oh, there you are.
Thank you, Bishop Buddy, and thank you to Washington National Cathedral for partnering with us on this amazing event and hosting it in this beautiful and iconic space. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Today marks the 150th anniversary of President Lincoln's second inaugural address. In a few weeks, we will also mark the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's death. This time period between March 4th and April 15th, 1865, is perhaps the most critical period in the history of America. A gruesome civil war ended, a nation began to reunify, and we lost one of our greatest leaders this country would ever know. We will never know what might have happened if Lincoln had lived, but we can't help but wonder, would Reconstruction have proceeded differently? Would Jim Crow laws have still come to the South? Would it have taken another 100 years for a Civil Rights Act to be passed? Tonight, we have the opportunity to explore two great leaders separated by 100 years, but united by history. Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. dealt with polarizing divisions and called for a unified nation. What can we learn from their final speeches about America then and now? I want to thank you again for joining us tonight. Ford's Theater has a number of events planned between now and May, marking the anniversary of Lincoln's death and the end of the Civil War. In your program, you will find details. I hope you will be able to join us for some or all of those events. I'd like to now introduce you to our moderator for this evening. After serving in the Peace Corps in Africa, Chris Matthews worked in the United States Senate and moved on to be a presidential speechwriter. He then became top aide to the legendary Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. Since becoming a journalist, he's had an incredibly successful career, punctuated by skillful and tactful coverage of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the first all-races election in South Africa, among many other news events. He is probably best known today for his show Hardball with Chris Matthews on MSNBC. Chris is also the author of 7 best-selling books on the 20th century political figures and policies that have shaped our country and what America means today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my friend and moderator for this evening, Chris Matthews.
Thank you. Well, welcome. The weather tonight, I checked, as we honored the sesquicentennial of Lincoln's second inaugural, was a little different on March 4th of 1865. It was wet. It had been wet for weeks. That sounds familiar. But it wasn't as cold. There's no reference to snow in what I've been able to dig up. It was just wet. And on the east front of the U.S. Capitol, it was thick in mud, deep mud. Everyone had to go out there and stand in it to watch what I think most of us believe was the greatest speech in American history, the second inaugural. And I believe that because how does a man stand before his people and say, 600,000 people are dead because I was president? And the horror of that war and what it meant to a country, which was a small country then of only 30 million people. And the losses, just imagine 6 million people dead today. We've never gone through anything like this. And the heart was ripped out of the country, and we were ripped apart. And he was trying to explain why it had a lot to do, in fact, essentially to do with the evil of slavery. And somebody had to pay for it, and that was us. Pretty frightening stuff, a powerful speech. Joining us right now for our panel tonight to talk about that, the very Reverend Gary Hall, who's the 10th Dean of Washington National Cathedral. Dean Hall. Dr. Clayborne Carson is the director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford. And Douglas Wilson is currently George A. Lawrence Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus at Knox College, where he's co-director of the Lincoln Studies Center. And now, the specialty of the night, and the young ladies are waiting. I'd like to welcome our orators for the evening. They will read excerpts from speeches that were given 103 years apart, both at a time of conflict and great change in society. Both speeches called people together and asked them to take responsibility for their country and for their fellow citizens. And both speeches look back on what was and make the case that the situation was untenable. Nadia Duncan loves singing and acting and writing. That's a good combination. She plans to study musical theater in college. Nadia will read an excerpt from President Lincoln's second inaugural address given on the east portico of the Capitol, the newly constructed dome behind him. The North stood at that moment on the brink of victory. Nadia Duncan.
On the occasion corresponding to this, 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, urgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we not be judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. 'The Almighty has his own purposes. 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 'The Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense come, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid with another drawn by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are righteous and true altogether. With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Thank you.
Paige Telsford was introduced to oratory in a pilot program at Central High School through Ford's Theater. Through the program, she became an oratory leader. Paige will read an excerpt from Martin Luther King's "I Have Been to the Mountaintop" speech given in Memphis during the sanitation workers' strike and before a big protest march. Memphis city officials had asked a federal judge to issue an injunction blocking the march.
Another reason that I'm happy to live in this period is that we have been forced to a point where we are going to have to grapple with the problems that men have been trying to grapple with through history, but the demands didn't force them to do it. Survival demands that we grapple with them. Men for years now have been talking about war and peace, but now no longer can they just talk about it. It is no longer a choice between violence and non-violence in this world. It's non-violence or non-existence. That is where we are today. I can remember when Negroes were just going around, scratching where they didn't itch, laughing when they were not tickled. But that day is over. We mean business now. We are determined to gain our rightful place in God's world. And that's all this whole thing is about. We aren't engaged in any negative protests and in any negative arguments with anybody. We are saying that we are determined to be men. We are determined to be people. We are saying that we are God's children. And that we are God's children, we don't have to live like we're forced to live. All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. Somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right. And so just as I say, we aren't gonna let any dogs or water hoses turn us around. We aren't gonna let any injunction turn us around. We are going on. We need all of you. Let us rise up tonight with a greater readiness. Let us stand with a greater determination. Let us move on in these powerful days, these days of challenge, to make America what it ought to be. We have an opportunity to make America a better nation. And I want to thank God once more for allowing me to be here with you. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will see the promised land. And I'm so happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Thank you.
Well, those were more than recitations. Those were dramatizations. They were great. Thank you, Paige Telsford and Nadia Duncan. Thank you. Now for the grown-ups here, the older guys. Dr. Wilson, you worked on your Lincoln Studies Center at Knox College has been producing the annotated transcriptions of the Lincoln Papers for the Library of Congress. Take some time and give us a context of that night or that afternoon 150 years ago.
I tried to write a very brief, compact statement about the context, and I found that I couldn't do it. It was inadequate. So I thought I would just admit up front that my context is inadequate. But I'll try to give you a few things to think about. Actually, I want to talk about two contexts, because since this is a speech, there's the context in the external world, the battlefield, the situation in the country at large, and also what's going on in the mind of the writer. This terrible war, as Lincoln called it, picking up his own phrase from a letter they had written to Eliza P. Gurney, had been going on for 4 years, and only in the past few months had the tide been running very favorably. As late as the previous August, Lincoln himself was convinced that he probably would not be elected. But some decisive military victories, combined with a badly misjudged peace platform by the opposing party and a strong endorsement from the soldiers' vote, brought the president a solid victory in November. And only days before he delivered his second inaugural, to the dismay of even his closest associates, he engineered the passing of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, banning slavery. Part of the context of any great national occasion is the public's expectation. In 1865, the country expected their re-elected president to talk about at least two important subjects: the war, and even more importantly, Reconstruction. What would happen after the war? Imagine the public's astonishment when he said virtually nothing about the war and nothing at all specifically about Reconstruction. And yet he said a great deal. What the address was mostly about was the product of something which the public knew very little, if anything, namely the president's protracted meditation on the meaning of the war. Specifically, why had it come, and why was it lasting so long? This last part, there's evidence that he really studied that hard. For at least a year prior to the inaugural address, we can identify in Lincoln's writings and his conversations tracings of the ideas that are central to the second inaugural. Some of his writings contained similar phrases and propositions, such as the Hodges letter and the letter to Eliza P. Garney, which I referred to, and his speech at Baltimore, all had a different kind of statement, but a recognizable statement of the same themes, coming about a year before. Perhaps the most revealing of these is the private memorandum aimed at understanding what could be deduced about the war from his major premise, which was the will of God prevails. What can be deduced from that is the subject of his meditation. Now, Lincoln was a lifelong fatalist who believed, in the words of Alexander Pope, that whatever is right. Even though he was for most of his life a religious skeptic, he nonetheless accepted the idea of an overruling providence, and at least by this time, in a moral universe. The conclusion that he came to, and that he expressed in the speech, he realized would at first not be popular, but he called it a truth that needed to be told. This is the private context of which I spoke earlier and which I hope will occupy a good share of our attention this evening.
How did the speech get received? It was tough on us.
Yeah, you know, it was a dour occasion, except for the sunlight that burst on him as he started to speak, and everybody was wet and muddy, and there was not a very strong reaction, which is what he was expecting, that there wasn't much to cheer about in what he said. And I think you have to put it in the context also of 19th century political oratory. People came to these things to be cheered up, give them something to yell about. Yeah. Most politicians would have thrown them red meat, victory and blood and so forth. Well, and he gave them a theological interpretation of the war.
What about the bloody shirt crowd? Were they offended by the malice towards none reference?
Yes, the people who wanted a strong Reconstruction, the hard hand of war going down south, hanging people, trying people, putting a lot of people in prison, which he was totally against. He didn't say it in so many words, but they knew what with malice toward none meant. Charles Sumner says, this speech augurs trouble.
Trouble. But then you look and see how that presaged the deal at Appomattox Courthouse, where I assume operating under somebody's instructions.
Yes,
Grant said you go home with your horse, you can keep your sidearms, it's over. You're free.
He got those instructions from Lincoln. Let him up easy.
Let him up easy. Wow. Well, let's move on to Dr. Carson. The late Coretta Scott King selected you, sir, to edit and publish the papers of Dr. Martin Luther King. Talk about the address we heard tonight.
Well, I think that it's, in some ways, there's a parallel with Lincoln in the sense that Lincoln believed that the second inaugural was the better speech than the Gettysburg Address. The world has told King that the better speech was the I Have a Dream speech. But arguably, I think the speech he gave in Memphis was a better speech. It was a fuller speech. It was a more coherent speech. And I think what he was trying to do was sum up the meaning of his life. He had reached the point where he was ready for death, but he had always been ready for that. But I think what he was coming to decide was that he was not going to accomplish his great goals in life. Some people, most of you perhaps, think of him as a civil rights leader. He did not think of himself that way. He was a social gospel minister who got recruited into the civil rights movement by Rosa Parks. And she's the one who made him into a civil rights leader, and he did that fairly well. I think all of us would agree for about 10 years. And the civil rights agenda was pretty well completed by 1965. But if you look at his papers, as I've done for the last 30 years, you find that his agenda went much beyond civil rights reform. And he makes that clear in many of his early papers. He certainly makes that clear after he gets the Nobel Peace Prize, that his agenda is partly racial justice, but also ending poverty throughout the world, not just in the United States, ending war throughout the world. That's a pretty ambitious agenda. And what happens during the next few years is that all the popularity that he gains from the I Have a Dream speech, from getting the Nobel Prize, from the success of that civil rights agenda, he is enormously popular. And he spends that popularity quite rapidly as he moves to these other issues, as he moves to Chicago, as he moves to takes on the war in Vietnam, as he launches the Poor People's Campaign, as he goes to Memphis, which is opposed by even members of his staff who think, why are you going to Memphis? We've got a Poor People's Campaign, and you're getting distracted by this sanitation workers strike that no one has even heard of. So that's the context in which he gives that speech, that he wants to explain, and in some ways I think similarly to Lincoln, he wants to explain why we're here. What's the significance of that? And maybe that's one of the great things about a great speech, is that it provides meaning that goes beyond what most people think should be the meaning of the event. And when you were mentioning about the second inaugural, how he doesn't say what people want him to say, expect him to say. Well, I was at the March on Washington here, and most people expected him to say something about Kennedy's civil rights legislation. He doesn't mention it in the speech. And that kind of, you think you're here for one purpose, I'm here to tell you you're fighting for something much deeper than that, much more important than that. And it has transcendent meaning. And so I think that's what he wanted to do with that speech.
When I remember the time when he moved from being a civil rights leader, as in the eyes of most people, whites and blacks, and he became a critic of the war. Of course, we all remember here, in '68 it was a divisive issue, very much a divisive issue. You had the hard hats, and you had the college kids all at war, generational struggle in every family in America. And a lot of people felt at the time he had gone out of his lane, that his lane was civil rights. What's he talking against the war for? He's pushing this thing. Mm-hmm. He knew that, right? Or did he?
Oh, of course he knew it. And I think that at a certain point he has a fatalistic kind of notion that that's a prophetic mission that he sees as and that's why I call him a social gospel minister who got distracted by civil rights, is that he is very clear about his mission. In one of our volumes, we publish a paper that he wrote in 1948 when he was a seminary student. At that point, he would have been 19 years old. And so one of the things he's asked is, well, what is going to be your mission as a minister? And he says, to deal with slums, unemployment, economic insecurity. He doesn't mention civil rights. But think of what he's doing 20 years later in Memphis. He's dealing precisely with those kinds of economic issues. And so, in a way, what happens is that he comes back to his original mission, but he knows that as a prophet, he knows that he's not going to be popular doing that. The prophets, the biblical prophets, the Hebrew prophets that he models himself on, were not popular in their time. They were not saying what people expected them to say. Most of them were challenging the religious establishment and insisting that they had wandered from God's will, and they were there to remind them, because they had spoken to God the day before, and this was not the way God wanted them to go.
Well, they both went the same way. And I want to ask you both about security today and security then. They both talked right into the face of their enemies. They challenged the country. They were at war with half the country. Dr. King was facing, well, conservative whites, if you want to generalize, but just people who hated him. He had no security at the time. Did he have any security in Memphis?
Very little. And one of the things he realized when you go back and look at that, how little security compared to practically any person now. There's probably more security within 100 yards of here than there was at that crucial time.
And when you go through his papers, there was was there evidence of threats?
Yeah, and now we know a lot more about the threats that were there at that time. For example, one of the things we know is that military intelligence was watching him, but they weren't there to guard him. They were there to monitor his activities. They were in the fire station right across the street from where the Lorraine Hotel was. So he had a lot of threats that we're still finding out about. But I think that the important thing for him was that he understood that from his days in Montgomery, he goes through what some call the kitchen experience, where he gets these calls threatening his life, threatening his family, repeated calls, and at one point he just breaks down and just, I can't take this, I didn't ask for this, and he's ready to give up, and he has a religious experience. He feels a presence of God telling him to continue on, and I think from that point on, he understands that yes, this might lead to my death, but this is the course I've taken, and there's a fatalistic part of it. Some of you have probably seen the movie Selma, and there's a scene in it where he's attacked in the hotel, and there's another similar thing that happens in Birmingham where someone just comes up and clobbers him, a guy who was a Nazi. And everyone around described his reaction to it of not even surprise, of just, in fact, in the Birmingham incident, he immediately is more concerned about his attacker than about himself. Everyone else is concerned about him. And he goes into a room and actually has a conversation with the guy who attacked him. So it's something that was deeply felt by him, that his life might end at any point, and particularly when you get to 68, after the level of violence that was in the country at that time. This is after major urban rebellions in Detroit and Newark.
There's a real parallel with Lincoln. He didn't like protection. He fought against it. He evaded it all the time. And he never really had very much protection anyway. The police assigned a guy to come and hang out around the White House. But he was the kind of fatalist who started talking before he became president about the fact that he had an intuition that he was going to meet some kind of terrible end. And he told lots of people that. And when he got to be president, he told more than one person that he didn't think he was going to finish, he was going to outlive the war. And I think that you can see that. Of course, it's easier to see things in retrospect, but you can see that in the second inaugural. He hasn't got a program. He isn't going to tell you how you're going to do it, but he describes why it's happened. He puts in there strong language so that people who are tempted to say, well, maybe the war really wasn't about slavery. Maybe it was about regional differences and economics and, backward economy or something. He says, he makes it so clear, and he says it in such a careful way. But he had the sense, I believe, and I think you can see the strains of it, that he probably wasn't going to make it, and certainly that's what Dr. King was saying the night before his assassination.
And isn't there an irony that Lincoln and King were actually the best hope of the other side. They were the ones who were ready to reach out.
And King, I was in this wonderful little collection of King's speeches that you have. There's a great sermon in there about nonviolence. It's really about Ghana, but he says the genius of the nonviolent revolution is you don't make bitter enemies of the people that lose, and they can help you rebuild. And this is Lincoln's point. He doesn't say he learned it from Lincoln, but it's exactly the way he talked. He didn't like talk about them as the heavies. He didn't like to use the word treason. He would occasionally, but he was always saying, all we are asking is that you come back into the Union and take up your place as citizens of the Union. That's all we want. And that of course wasn't enough for most people, but I think that's what he wanted. And it's the same idea. That's so that we can minimize the hatred and bitterness afterwards.
Yep. Great. I love listening to this. Dina Hall, you've been charged with giving us an intellectual of going through the history and the emotions of this. You've been charged with a somewhat dry challenge of speaking about the religious and the intellectual references made in these addresses the young lady just gave us portions of.
Well, I always love the exciting opportunity to be the guy that closes the evening down. I've killed more parties than I can even think of. A couple of thoughts about these two addresses. I mean, first of all, we live in a time of a great decline, even in my own lifetime, in our own lifetimes, of decline of political oratory. And what we have here are two wonderful examples of very different kinds of oratory. King is a great high-style speaker. In many ways, a lot in common with speakers like Churchill and Kennedy, a lot of high-style rhetoric. And Lincoln, of course, is in many ways a plain-style speaker. King is expansive and tells stories. Lincoln really, it's almost like reading an Emily Dickinson poem. It's very compressed. And the thing about Lincoln's speech, which I just love so much, is that it starts out almost like a shareholders report. It's extremely dull at the beginning. He tells you why he's not going to give a big speech. And then by the end, he's given the most profound theological exposition of what's happened in the course of the war. King, on the other hand, is obviously a master orator of a very different kind, and King uses the kind of the expansive storytelling mode as a way to really engage the audience. And I would say, for me, what's really interesting theologically about these two speeches is how different they are. I mean, if we're in a moment of decline of oratory, we're also in a moment of just the worst kind of public theology that you can imagine. I mean, politicians all speak about God in very kind of formulaic, pro forma ways in the 21st century. These two people are actually theological thinkers. And Lincoln is looking at the war, and he's trying to understand God's agency in that war. And he comes up with this idea, essentially, that America is a kind of a Christ figure, that America is suffering because of the sins of slavery. King, very interestingly, goes the other direction, and we didn't hear read tonight, but the speech begins with him imagining God taking him on a flight through human history. And he starts seeing the Exodus, and he flies from the Exodus to the Parthenon, from the Parthenon to Martin Luther, from Martin Luther to the Founding Fathers, to Abraham Lincoln trying to decide to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, to then Franklin Roosevelt writing his first inaugural. And he says, but of all the times in human history I would want to be alive, I'd want to be alive for a few years in the middle of the 20th century. Because what King sees when he looks at American history is actually this expansive story of liberation. So Lincoln, in a way, even though he's on the verge of winning a war, is giving a kind of penitential speech, whereas King, at the lowest moment of his life, you might say, is giving this really wonderful, resurrected kind of speech about the advancement of human freedom. And they're both trying to read history and see what God is doing in history. And they do it in very different ways, but they do it with enormous profundity. And again, I think it's a kind of not only rhetoric, but a kind of a theological reading of history that we just don't do anymore. And I think we can learn a lot from.
I found myself somewhat amazed going back and realizing that Lincoln gives two of the greatest speeches in less than 1,000 words total of the two speeches together.
Right.
King would take that long to go from "I'm coming to the conclusion" to the conclusion. but King was a Baptist minister, and that's part of the deal you get. But I think you're right that King is telling a parable. I mean, it's the Exodus parable, which has been one of the most powerful liberation stories, certainly the most powerful liberation story in African American history, but I think in Western history. It's a story we just keep coming back to in different forms. And I think what he's doing is he's taking what many people involved in the sanitation workers' strike, they're looking at themselves and saying, we've been out on strike, we're trying to get a 10-cent an hour raise, and they don't even recognize our union, and no one really cares. And he's coming to tell them that they are the Exodus story.
Right.
That they are escaping from Pharaoh. That this is something that in the history of the world, they are part of this story. And it seems to me that that's one of the things that made King such a powerful figure, is that for many of us who were involved in the struggle, we thought it was, well, getting a seat at a lunch counter, or getting a better seat on a bus, or getting a piece of civil rights legislation passed. And to have someone telling you, even if you don't believe it, that you were part of one of the greatest, what I would consider the greatest freedom struggle the world has ever seen. Because King saw it in global terms.
Right.
And one thing that we don't often recognize is that while we're, as Americans, we're focused on civil rights struggles, around the world there were anti-colonial struggles going on. So while African Americans were getting full civil rights here, the majority of humanity were for the first time becoming citizens.
Right, he mentions those 1960, all of the kind of changes in Africa.
He goes
in
into
the speech,
Africa
right.
and different places and puts it in that context of that you are part of the greatest freedom struggle the world has ever seen. And of course I would want to be here. Even though he says, even though the world is all messed up.
Right.
I'd rather be here than be in the Renaissance and the Reformation and all of that. So
I'd rather be here in Memphis tonight on the eve of a sanitation worker strike, rather than watching Martin Luther pound his 95 Theses to the door. Yes. I mean, he has this wonderful way of bringing you in. I think the other thing is, I'm neither a King nor a Lincoln scholar, but I've read and studied a lot about both of them. But I think people always, the way in which the I Have a Dream speech has become the kind of standard by which people think about King, people forget the depth of his intellectual theological sophistication. I mean, the public does. I mean, I think, when you read Letter from Birmingham Jail and you see just the depth of his learnedness and the kind of the sharpness of his theological insight. And whereas Lincoln was, as you said, really a kind of a lifelong skeptic and not someone who would have even maybe defined himself as a Christian in many ways, but yet he has this also deep kind of self-taught understanding of theology. And they both use the text differently. I mean, Lincoln quotes passages. Lincoln uses the Bible almost as a kind of cultural glue, that these are phrases you are going to recognize and it will help connect me with my audience, in the same way that Shakespeare quotations were often used in the 19th century. King retells the story of the Good Samaritan, and again brings the people into that story and says that we've got to find a way to identify with the other, not to think about ourselves, but to think about the guy lying in the street. And it's very different strategies, but both very effective in their own way.
And I was thinking that, Chris, you mentioned the horrendous butcher bill of the war and how that was a huge part of the context. And I think that's one of the things that was weighing on Lincoln's mind, because when even in this meditation that he writes, you can see that it isn't the why as much as it's the why so long that's getting to him. He says, if God wanted to, if he wanted it that way, it could end tomorrow. But it doesn't end. The war goes on. So that means he just lets the logic work. So it means somehow that there's a reason that the war has to go on this long, that the mortality bill has to get so long. And that's the understanding he comes to, but with the end in sight. I think he despaired before, but I think with the end in sight, he can say, now we've found that this is the reason it had to go on so long, is because the North is complicit in slavery as much as the South.
How so?
Well, because they're the whole experiment in American democracy, which is the thing that he thinks is the most precious thing, is contaminated with slavery. They didn't deal with it in the Constitution.
Yeah. Let me ask you all, before we're going to ask everybody to fill out those cards with their questions. That'll be the big part of the evening. We're going to get to that in a minute, so we'll be collecting them now, your questions. The Lincoln Memorial just staggers me. I know this is the National Cathedral for everyone, and it takes pride in that. But the secular temple of this city is the Lincoln Memorial. And I think people go to it. If Dr. King went there in '63, you go there. Marian Anderson went there in '39 when she couldn't, the racists at the Daughters of the American Revolution wouldn't let her sing at Constitution Hall. Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington goes there in despair. It's really interesting how that temple.
Richard Nixon went there one night. You remember?
Pardon me?
Richard Nixon went there one night.
Well, to meet and talk sports with the demonstrators, but let's be serious. Sure. I think the city, it's really about, it's on our penny, it's on our $5 bill. It's where King went. It's almost primordial, isn't it?
Well,
Dr. Carson, to go there and give the speech that matters.
There's a number of things I would say about that. One of them is that it's kind of an accident that his speech was delivered at the Lincoln Memorial. What most people who supported the idea of the march was aimed at Congress. They wanted to come to the steps of the Capitol and have the protest there. John F. Kennedy did not want the protest there. Certainly no one in Congress, even favoring civil rights, wanted it there.
They didn't want it at the White House.
So when you look at the mall, what is the farthest place away from the Capitol? Of course, we're sending them down there. So they thought that this was a punishment. And it turned out to be this wonderful decision, because everyone then had that symbolic importance of King when he's delivering his speech, and he frames his speech this way. He had Lincoln on his mind the whole time he's preparing his remarks. And he mentions 50 years ago, Lincoln delivered his great speech. He mentions the Emancipation Proclamation 100 years before the March on Washington. So he really has Lincoln on his mind as he's preparing this speech. By the way, he was given 5 to 7 minutes to give a speech. Asking a Baptist minister to give a speech in 5 to 7, you're asking for trouble. He did prepare this wonderfully crafted speech, probably the most crafted speech he ever wrote. because most of the time he never sat down and wrote out a speech. At the end of 7 minutes, he decided to tell them about his dream. So the irony is that the most famous speech he ever gave would not have happened if he had stuck to the rules. And that was all extemporaneous about the dream.
But like Lincoln, he had tried out some of these ideas earlier.
Oh yes, very, very much so, yeah.
The interesting genesis of all this goes back to the Declaration as our founding document, not the Constitution.
Right.
It's Gary Wills wrote about this, and the idea that, and King, of course, in his I Have a Dream speech, quoted from the Declaration. I love the Declaration. The Constitution we can argue about. But there's something about how the Declaration just has risen up as our founding, starting with Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address 47 years ago. And then, of course, these references that we all make to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we hold these truths to be self-evident. We don't quote the Constitution. We quote that is so much a straight line, a trajectory from 1776 to where we are right now, because the unpaid check or the bad check that Dr. King talked about, it was a great metaphor. We're coming here we want payment on that check. You said we would have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay. Give me. It's pretty strong history.
Well, and in Inventing America, Gary Wills does make that point that the Gettysburg Address actually is Lincoln reframing the whole story of America from the Constitution to the Declaration.
Yeah.
And when you're in the Lincoln Memorial, which I visit as often as I can, the Declaration's carved in its entirety on one side, and the second inaugural is carved in its entirety on the other side. And then when you step back from it, one of the most moving things to me about that building is that the seals of each of the states is at the top near the roof line. So it's like the building, in some sense, incorporates the saving of the Union in its own architecture.
So now we're going to get the questions. And they're being brought here just like in the Academy Award. Somebody's coming forward with the winning questions. Here they come. I'm making a run. I think these are going to be great.
They're coming.
Thank you very much. Well, this is great. It's prescriptive. What is the best way we can remember Lincoln and Dr. King here in the 21st century and keep their memories alive? Dean Hall.
Well, I think two really quick thoughts. One of them is thinking about King and thinking about the current state of race relations in America, and thinking about Lincoln and about the legacy of slavery. It does seem to me that the president has called for a national conversation on race. We're clearly in a moment where America's history on race is coming back again to reassert itself, and we need to engage it. And I think the best way to keep them alive is really seriously, as a national community, to have that conversation about race, and to go to Lincoln and to King for guidance about that. I mean, I've taught in schools, and I've seen the way we turn both Lincoln and King into old dead guys, but I do think this current moment of real anger and tension and fear and anxiety about race relations is a moment to go back and bring them into the living present.
But in connection, yeah. But I'll pass on that.
I think that one of the things that draws King and Lincoln together is that they both thought of American democracy as an experiment whose outcome we still don't know. I think many Americans become complacent about, yes, of course we're going to succeed as a nation. We've been here for over 200 years. 200 years in the history of the world is a very short time. And I would argue that only during the last 50 or so years have we really been a democracy. So we really have only about 50 years of opening up the notion of democracy to include everyone. And that experiment is what King and Lincoln were both speaking about. I mean, they make it explicit that this might not work. And Lincoln, at the end of the war, he's saying we might survive, and the Gettysburg Address is around that theme of we might survive as a nation, we might not. And I think the general feeling of Americans when they celebrate King or Martin Luther King is that it symbolizes patting ourselves on the back for the accomplishments we've had. That if not for King, we wouldn't have a civil rights bill. If not for King, we would still be having had Jim Crow. But King was not overly concerned about whether we got a civil rights bill. I mean, when you think about it, that's not very much of an accomplishment. And what I mean by that is that the 14th and 15th Amendments state it much more clearly than the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. If we wanted a clear statement of the right to vote, we had it. It was passed, 150 years ago. And why did we need a Voting Rights Act? Because we didn't obey the clear language of the Constitution. So I think that when we look at ourselves honestly, I think the one quality that Americans have more than anything else is self-confidence. And it's misplaced. I mean, we think of ourselves, we're the richest nation, we're the freest nation, and never put those statements to a test. So we have a very inflated notion of our capabilities as a democratic society. And I think if King or Lincoln were around today, Lincoln for a different reason, I think he was just a skeptic about it. It was all in God's hands anyway, so.
Yes, we can hope. He's big on hope.
Right.
But I was going to say the questioner wanted a practical suggestion, I think, and so I'll just say this: take advantage of the fact that certainly for the generations that are here now, the Lincoln Memorial has become not just about Lincoln, but it's also about Martin Luther King, and we should encourage that the whole idea of monuments is to help cherish and keep alive and promote what they represent, because it's human nature to become complacent.
Well, maybe I'm more optimistic than you, but I admit to that. You sound a little dismal here about where we're going. I think that
it's optimistic to think of it as an experiment.
Yeah. Because I look at everybody in this room and I can tell you that the general rule of us all is that we are more liberal and better on race than every one of our parents. And our kids are better than us. It's just a fact. It's just a fact. My kids don't come home and say, I got a black teacher at school. You don't know the guy's black till you go to the PTA meeting. They don't even bring it up. I know it sounds fanciful, but it's true. My kids don't think about it. In fact, I've insisted on the word ethnicity, not race, because race is a stupid word, because we're all in the same race. But I just say ethnicity. And they're not even aware of that. I think it's really gotten so much different. We're going to have more intermarriage. We're going to have more. I don't know if the walls of geographic segregation are going to drop. They haven't dropped yet. There's a lot that hasn't changed, but.
Chris, I would agree with everything you're saying, except that one thing that is true is that Johnson, and you're a political expert, Johnson in 1964 won by a landslide. That is the last election in which the majority of white Americans and the majority of black Americans have voted for the same candidate. It hasn't happened since, and it's not likely to happen in the lifetime of any of us up here.
Yeah. I guess I'd say I'm hopeful and Where I agree with Lincoln is I think that slavery is still deeply embedded in our the legacy of slavery is still deeply part of our national problem, and we keep on telling ourselves. We keep it at these moments where we say, it's like when you go through therapy and then you think you're well and then you discover 10 years later you got to go back into therapy. Slavery feels like that to me in America, that it's our problem, that we're all, at best we're going to be in recovery from slavery, but I don't think we'll ever be healed as a nation from slavery.
Let me go to another question. Well, this is just looking for trouble here. Who made a larger impact on modern society, Lincoln or King? I mean, I don't know what the purpose is. Somebody just wants a little fight here, I think. What do you think? Who wants to take up this calibration?
I look upon Jefferson, Lincoln, and King as in this perpetual dialogue about American democracy. So one without the other doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. I think if you look at Lincoln's draft of, the Declaration of Independence, and the way in which later on Lincoln has his commentary on that, King has his commentary on Lincoln having a commentary on that, that's the American dialogue. And so you can't take one of them out of that. King's speeches don't make any sense without Lincoln or Jefferson.
Yeah, it might be the bad American habit of always having to know who is the biggest or what is the longest or the farthest.
We have to have a contest.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about what sort of seems to be behind this, being experts about these two gentlemen. What was it that they didn't say? Let's start with the more recent Dr. King. Well, let's start with Lincoln, because there was always a question when his second inaugural, he said all we wanted to do was prevent the expansion of slavery. Okay, that's all he politically knew he could do, was stop expanding it so that it wouldn't get to the point where, well, they would get to the point of outlawing slavery if they stopped the expansion by using the Constitution at some point. But what was Lincoln's goal? Was it equality? Was it social integration? Did he ever intimate what his dream was, or his notion of a good country?
I think he was, most of the time, what he once described as behaving like a river pilot. In the Mississippi River, it's such a treacherous river that the pilot can only steer from point to point because the river will have changed since the last time he was there. So Lincoln said, I take my cue from them, and in other words, I take one step at a time. And when I get to that point, I'll see what it looks like down the river. I think he's so much that way that it's hard to say. I think one of the things, I think this is a point Gary Wills makes or hints at, and that is that he doesn't say anything about Reconstruction because he hasn't gotten any farther with it than charity for all, malice toward none. That's the way we're going to go into it. And he doesn't have a program. He's getting a lot of flack from his first feelers to say, well, the soldiers who fought for us, we got to let them vote, right? And the ones who were educated, we got no reason not to have them vote. Why can't we start there? So he's put out something in the way of race relations and improvement. But he doesn't have a program. He hasn't drawn up a bureaucratic arrangement of how the Freedmen's Bureau is going to work. He steers from point to point. He is a big vision man if malice toward none and charity for all is big vision, which I think it is. Especially if you can say it in a way that people can't forget it. Then you can it can stay with you. Other people can use it. This is what he said was the reason that writing was the greatest invention. He said, if somebody writes it down, then it doesn't matter if it's forgotten for 1,000 years, it's written down. And the person who can use it 1,000 years later finds it where it's written and then goes on. So I think that's the kind of thinker he was.
But he knew, the term is African American is new, but he knew people who had come from slave backgrounds who were capable of high intellectual ability. I mean, Frederick Douglass, he knew he could converse in very sophisticated terms with people. So did he have any sense in his head of it sounds like he didn't have any ceiling on black potential compared to white potential? Did he have any sense of differences in development, if you will, or didn't he?
He doesn't really talk about this, and you have to kind of intuit it from his attitudes and so forth. But he's professionally closed-mouthed. All of his friends talk about this. Not even his friends know his deepest thoughts. And I don't have to tell Chris Matthews that when a politician opens his mouth, nothing but the truth from his heart comes out.
I know.
And Abraham Lincoln was a politician.
Yeah, so he knew how far he could go.
Yeah.
Dr. King, what was he? Did we know if he was a socialist? Do we know what he had any ideology at all? Or do we know?
He was not a politician. He was not very good at that because he was a visionary. And the goals that he had in mind, one of the things I invite you to do, there was, in the latest book, Martin's Dream, I have a chapter about the love letters that he wrote to Coretta when they were dating back in 1952. And you get into the question of, was he a socialist? Yes, he was a socialist. He was a Christian socialist, anti-communist socialist, but he was definitely a socialist. That's what they wrote love letters about. They were discussing Edward Bellamy and looking backward. And one of the things he says in one of the letters is, let us promise to work together to have a warless world, a better distribution of wealth, and it goes on to these. These are obviously the things that all of you wrote in your love letters, right? So, but it's very clear that, and by the way, and it gets to the question of whether he was a politician, Coretta kept those letters under her bed until 1997. That's why you probably don't know about the letters. Can you imagine what would have happened to King's career if a letter was published? I look forward to the day when there's a nationalization of industry, he says in one of the letters. All of these things in the context of the Cold War in the 50s, that would have destroyed him as a leader. All the suspicion. I don't think J. Edgar Hoover made a distinction between socialism and communism. That would not have been one of the distinctions he would ever make. So King was someone who was in favor of the kinds of changes that we are still probably 100 years old. That's why he liked Bellamy, because he was basically a science fiction writer about, America in the 2000, right? So, he was not a very accurate science fiction writer, but neither was Space Odyssey. So.
Yeah, I know. Well, we lost Mr. Spock this week.
Yes.
Dean, I want to ask you about something because I don't think you're right about something, which is we should have a national discussion about race. And let me tell you, in my experience, every time you bring it up, the room goes cold. And African Americans and whites alike, mostly African Americans, are very uncomfortable with this discussion because what it is about, in day-to-day terms, is bigotry. It's about not liking the company or the looks or any way you want to describe it of the other person, not being comfortable about it. And people don't like talking about it because it's embarrassing to everybody. You can't get a conversation about race. I've tried it on TV and, this is fascinating, let's talk about the intellectual aspect. People pull back.
But maybe we're redefining the question.
I think we probably
help me here.
Obviously, I'm sure it makes bad television. My experience, though, I have been in conversations about race with a diverse group of people that have been carefully moderated, and they've been very transformative, kind of life-giving conversations. They are hard conversations, but I don't know how and maybe the national conversation about race is the wrong phrase. I mean, that's the president's phrase. I do think, though, we've got to find a way as a society to engage these questions of difference and bigotry and everything, because otherwise it just keeps on coming back up to, I mean, I think I was surprised. I think we were all surprised about the amount of rage in the shootings this summer and fall, and the police-involved shootings, both in Ferguson and Eric Garner and that kind of stuff. So I agree with you that it's a kind of buzzkill kind of suggestion. But we've got to find, I think as a society, we can't go very much farther forward just not talking about it or dealing with it, or limping from crisis to crisis.
I want to run all these questions by everybody. You pick your poison, because there's some great ones here. Could you please comment on the writing process of Lincoln and King? How did they go about deciding the themes and structure, especially in relation to the inclusion of theological thoughts? Does that grab anybody?
Well, Lincoln has the reputation, of being a guy who writes his speeches on envelopes. So that story came forward in a fictional thing at the turn of the 20th century, and it took such a hold on the public, it just won't let go. But on the contrary, he was very, very deliberative. He was what I call a pre-writer. If he had an idea, he would put it down. If he thought of a phrase, he would write it down. He was always cooking the next message, the next thing he wanted to say, working on the idea. Then he waited for the occasion. So if you think he wrote his letter to Greeley after he got attacked by Greeley, no way. He was ready with that answer. Compact and made to order as it seems. He made it that way. He did this with all of his writings that I've been able to track. He also liked to, he didn't think it was done until he had read it to somebody. You would think that he could get that by reading it to himself, but he said, no, that doesn't work. So one time he usually got senior statesmen, Old Man Blair or somebody like that. So tell me what you think of this. But one time he had to send it off. It was a letter, and there was nobody there. It was summertime, and he sat down the clerk in his office. And the clerk said, do you want me to comment on it, Mr. Lincoln? He said, no, just listen to it. I've got to have somebody to listen to it. So what I'm trying to say is he was a very, very deliberate writer, far more deliberate than people think, thinking ahead, not being taken by surprise, ready with a phrase, ready with a sentence, ready with one of his wonderful antithesis. Without it, I cannot fail. No, with it, I cannot win. Without it, I cannot fail, kind of thing. So he was this kind of writer. He spent, when you start tracking it, he spent a lot of time just writing. He'd say, no visitors this week. I'm working on my message. I just can't emphasize too much how much time he spent as president writing and how much good he did with these things, that the way in which they add up, not only for getting things done in the 1860s, but for the service that it's done for posterity.
King found it very difficult to write. Every one of his books was a struggle. I have all these letters between him and his publisher, and it was clear that he was struggling to get it done, and he asked for help, oftentimes getting it from his friends who would take on a chapter, and he would try to work with them. He rarely wrote out his speeches. His great quality was his memory. If he ever heard a speech or read something and there was some nugget of insight in it, he would pull it in, and it would go into his brain, and it would stay there until he needed it. Probably in the middle of some sermon that he hadn't. One of the sermons that I know he gave at visiting a church, he had the program. He's on the program. On the program, he's writing out his outline. So probably when he's sitting up here on the stage, he's writing some ideas out on the program, and then gets up and gives a great sermon. That's something that he picked up by listening to some of the great orators in African American history, Benjamin Mays, his father, other Gardner Taylor, all these people who were his models for oratory. So that's what made him.
Well, it's like a letter from Birmingham jail, which he wrote without any access to books,
exactly.
And it's full of direct quotations and indirect quotations from an astonishing array of sources.
Yeah.
Which had to mean he had to have those in his
Actually, maybe if he hadn't been in the jail, he wouldn't have had the time to actually concentrate, because he didn't like doing it. But I guess when you're in jail, you have nothing better to do, right?
What had to come to this, someone has written the question in the following way. Compare and contrast the approach of Lincoln and King to today's political leaders on issues of 1, economic justice, 2, social justice, 3, war as means to settle problems.
What, economic, social, and war?
And war, peace and war. And how compare their approach to today's leaders and their approaches.
Well, all I remember, I recently read King's Riverside Church speech, which he gave, which got him into a lot of hot water with people, because he said the 3 great challenges to American life were racism, materialism, and militarism. I mean, I think it's clear that at least on war and peace issues, King and Lincoln, Lincoln lamented the cost and bloodshed of the war, but Lincoln was obviously the commander-in-chief, whereas I would think King was much more of a peace person. So that would be clear to me. I'm not sure about the other ones. I mean, again, Lincoln was not an economic ideologue to the extent that I would know.
Well, we've had 3 orators as presidents in our lifetime, recent lifetime, and that's certainly Obama and Kennedy, and you have to say Reagan. They could give speeches with profound importance. They could say things philosophically, and we remember it, and we can argue about it. I personally think Obama was the best in my adulthood. He's unbelievable, but he's lost his ability to connect. I guess it wears out these days. It's hard to keep oratory connecting with people for a long time. I don't know if King could have kept it up. People stop listening after a while. Is there a duration that people are willing to give you as a leader these days?
For me, the most interesting speech Obama gave was when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, because then he had to, because before that time, he often used, he has that picture in his office of King and Gandhi, and I'm not sure who else is in the picture, but it's some obviously something that's very close to him. And he writes about this in his books, about how influenced he was by King and Gandhi. But when he gets the prize, what does he have to say? Well, I'm president now. And I remember for myself being very critical of him, because he says that, well, they didn't have to deal with terrorism, which I thought was laughable. King died because of terrorism, and Gandhi, what is colonialism other than terrorism? So what he was basically saying is that if King had been elected president in some miracle, he would have had to make the same kinds of compromises. And that may be true. That it may well be that one of the things about being the president of a modern nation state that has a monopoly on violence, at least it's supposed to, that's one of the things we're discussing, I guess, now with terrorism, you have to do what you have to do. And your basic job is to protect the nation. And I think that's one of the things that perhaps all of us face when we look at King and we say we admire him, but do we really believe in nonviolence as a principle? Well, I think most of us would say, yeah, I do, as long as there's the police who have guns to protect me, and the military who have guns to protect me. So it's kind of, maybe we're all hypocritical in that sense.
I think, in terms of the connecting issue, as a preacher, I would say, with rhetoric, the ability to speak involves an ability to connect with your audience and to empathize with your audience. And I wonder if modern presidents lose that because of the isolation of their office. I mean, King, was connected with the movement people he was with. Lincoln was much more connected to the average person than any modern president would be. And I just don't know a modern president really remembers his audience very much after 6 years in the office.
So true. Especially when your audience is being confected everywhere you go of loyalists. So they're going to give you the response you hope to get. Whereas when you campaign, you've got to sell people with you have to connect with them on their terms.
Right.
You got to go find them.
That's right.
And that's the challenge. Anyway, this has been a great night. I'm sure we could go on, and I do think these questions are great, especially the compare and contrast. It's definitely an academic person who's here. And
that was on my final exam.
I think it's on everybody's, but thank you. It's been an honor with you, Dean. Thank you, Dr. Carson, Dr. Wilson. I've learned a lot tonight, and I hope you all have too. Thank you very much. Thank you.